Hi, I'm the Questing GM, and I just thought that I should do an introduction video for the start of my new channel related to RPGs and gaming and whatnot. I'm a gamer from Malaysia, specifically from Sabah. I started gaming when I was around, I would say like when I was around 7. My start in gaming was actually a very, I would say, a rather unconventional route. First got into the idea of role-playing games was from homebrew systems. My elder brother used to make his own RPGs, and he himself, I think, was inspired by D&D. He would bring the concept back home from D&D, and he would try to like make a very simplified homebrew version of it. But obviously, a lot of things were like taken out, more easier, and some I would say maybe rather inspired by computer game RPGs as well, to make things easier to understand, especially for a 7-year-old kid. And actually, after that, I actually started doing my own, making my own RPGs. But obviously, uh, RPGs from a 8-year-old, 10-year-old was not really the most complex system that you ever see. While I was developing them, it actually eventually led me into looking into some of like other RPGs that were around. The only thing available back in the 90s, I would say, was AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I think it was the second edition, and I actually managed to get my hands on the player's handbook of AD&D. And the moment I started flipping through the pages and saw the illustrations, saw the tables, it just literally blew my mind. Role-playing games were not just the simple stats and dice mechanics that I grew up with playing, or at least I started with. And there was actually a much more complex system that was going on. There were actually more options at the time, at least the way I saw it. There were a lot of options, and there were a lot of progressions, and all, and everything was also laid out. So for a 10-year-old kid, it was just mind-blowing to see how complex and how far evolved that RPGs were already at the time. So obviously I had no knowledge about Gary Gygax then, and how D&D came about, and all the traditions that came along with it. That was actually my first foray into Dungeons and Dragons, AD&D, when I was like probably like 10 years old, and I started to read up a little bit about it when I was 12, up to I was 12. And obviously the hardest part was to find players to play, because not only no one knew about D&D, but nobody understood the concept of RPGs as well. Everyone was all hooked up to computer games, video games, and there wasn't even Baldur's Gate back then. It came out probably when I was 12, and only then people started playing Baldur's Gate, and only the idea of a role-playing game using dice rather than the computer started making a bit more sense. By the time I was 13, entering secondary school, I was running AD&D. To be honest, it was probably the most foolish thing ever to do, especially when you only had the player's handbook, and there was no other way to get access to the DMG and the monster manual. Although I actually did manage to get a CD, I think it was the Rules Encyclopedia, that contained all the books and all the supplements for AD&D, but I never really used those. Those were really fun to read and fun to flip through when I had the time. But for the bulk of my experience with AD&D, it was only just with the player's handbook, and I actually don't know how I managed to run games with just the player's handbook in hindsight. But to be honest, I think we weren't so worried about rules and the players that I managed to get through, which were my friends and classmates. We weren't so hung up on the rules, and we was just happy to just roll dice and just rub our hit points off sheets of very fancy looking character sheets, and somehow just making up a story as we went along. Just about then, I think I was running it for about a year or two, and that was when third edition came out. Third edition was, I would say, the one where I seriously got myself knee deep into Dungeons and Dragons as a whole. I started playing with other people outside my circle of friends, making new circle of friends and started playing with them. I would say the bulk of my experience and the things that I learned, the things that I think about in terms of role-playing games were foundational in third edition. In future videos, when I start talking about some my thoughts about GMing and games design or that sort of thing, it would be mostly coming from what I learned and experienced when I was running third edition. and subsequently from there. But my foundations are mostly from 3rd edition D20 based. I would say it had its ups and downs. I would say it's probably where I can understand people who come from that generation from that edition and what they're talking about sometimes. I've been trying not to let that inform my thinking as much as I want to. So 3rd edition and 3.5 took up most of my gaming life as a teenager. And when I was moving into university was the time when 4th edition came out. But university life was far different and much more busy. So 4th edition pretty much stayed under the radar for me. Although I did manage to run like I think one module, which was Keep on the Shadowfell, and then I never really got the chance to play much of it. But even then, I sort of have known my feelings about 4th edition, which is not always all bad, which is maybe something I will talk about in someday. Yeah, just the years went by, and by the time I graduated from university, was when they announced 5th edition or D&D Next, when it was still in the playtesting stage. So sorting throughout my working adult life to get back into gaming took me quite a number of years. It was hard to find a very stable job and living arrangement that allowed me to get back into gaming. So I would say that I've only returned to 5th edition for maybe about four years. I had to move from my home state of Sabah to Kuala Lumpur. Basically had to make a new life for myself. I eventually found new circle of friends, new gamers in Kuala Lumpur, which was much more abundant back in my home state. I've been gaming 5th edition ever since. I would say that's the gist of my life story in terms of gaming. Having said that, I think in the meantime a lot has developed in terms of how I think about games right now, and it's still developing. It's obviously a work in progress. It's never finished in that sense. For those who were in the blogosphere of RPGs, I would say somewhere around in the 2010s, I think, when I was in university, I started a gaming blog called The Questing GM. So I've been using that as my moniker when it comes to topics related to gaming and RPGs. If any of you have read The Questing GM, you will know that it has pretty much stayed dead for a very, very long time, despite my many efforts and attempts of trying to revive it and saying that I'm back. But after that, I go completely silent for a year. I'm not sure if I'll ever get back to writing the blog again as much as I want to, but commitments as a working adult is really not as free as I used to be, especially when I started the blog during my university days. But that's also part of the reason why I decided to move to YouTube and start a channel, because I think I'm allowed to make a lot of impromptu videos and I'm able to deliver more content more quickly by using this method. I've also started being more active on my Twitter, which I think I have left dormant for maybe a good 5 years. If anyone's been interested in my thoughts recently, you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on soon to be on YouTube, and also on Instagram, although I should post a bit more pictures there than I need to. That's basically an introduction of who I am. I'm the Questing GM. I'll probably do another video on why I decided to name myself the Questing GM, and also what are the kind of things that I like to explore and talk about in the future in the channel. It's good meeting you all. I hope that we'll get along and we'll have a lot of discussions in the future. So this is the Questing GM signing out for now. Bye.